expensive sampling machines available, which weren't available to average Joe public musicians at that time. For example, Daniel Miller bought something called the Synclavier in around 1983-84, which was £60,000. So you're looking at the price of a sizable London flat in 1984 terms that he was willing to invest in the sound of the group, if you like. So he was very much nurturing them and I think opening doors to them.
He won't have put a lot of pressure on them, so right, you want to be knocking out X many albums in this amount of years. They've been given enough license to sort of record when they feel they want to record, which I think increases the quality of what they do produce and consequently means they can keep going for longer.
It's only in more recent years that Mute finally succumbed and were bought by EMI, and I believe Daniel Miller got somewhere in the region of £18 million for that Depeche Mode finally had to sign a record deal effectively with EMI, although they're still with Mute. So quite what the terms of that are, I don't know, but up until that point, they've certainly had one of the most favourable deals in the industry.
During 1981, Depeche Mode embarked on production of their debut album, Speak and Spell, at Eric Radcliffe's Blackwing studio. Brian Griffin designed the album cover for Speak and Spell.
I'd heard of Depeche Mode as a pop group. They'd had some singles or whatever, and it was a job. I was a professional photographer. I'd been doing a number of album covers up to that point in time. I'd probably been working on album covers for about 3 years. And I sort of remember talking to them about the idea. It's very dim, distant past. And I know it ended up with a stuffed swan inside a plastic bag on top of foil that you put behind your radiators. I was left to do my own thing. I can't really remember ever having a heavy discussion with the band about what the album cover should look like. It ended up as the first album cover for Depeche, really.
With the release of Speak and Spell and appearances on Top of the Pops, Depeche Mode's fan base started to soar.
I remember being in work one day and Vince sort of came up to meet me and he had a pile of letters and he said, "Look, we've received these. These are the original first letters." He said, "Can you just write back to the people?" So I said, "Yeah, sure." And that's really how the fan club started. Just by getting a few letters and just sort of answering people, and then before we knew it, it was sort of hundreds of people and people from abroad, etc. And we had to sort of start up a newsletter, but obviously it was very, very naive and primitive compared to today. Literally writing people back by hand to start with, yeah.
Vince made the decision to leave Depeche Mode after their Parisian show during September 1981. However, he agreed to complete his role on Speak and Spell and the accompanying tour.
The other group members themselves weren't particularly surprised when he bailed out. And I think basically he'd worked so hard to get where he was that when he became effectively a pop star and in the limelight, which I don't think was ever his intention, he kind of panicked in a way, I think. It was a sort of situation, I've got here and I don't like it now.
Vince was getting very claustrophobic. It was nothing personal. It was nothing to do with the music or anything like that. It was just Vince getting claustrophobic and just wanting to. He started to hate doing interviews. He started to hate touring. I think he found the first tour particularly claustrophobic, and he just. I know it seems weird now because he went on to do Yazoo and Eurasia, of course. But he actually sort of just decided he didn't want to do it anymore. He just wanted to get himself in the studio and just work on music.
I think that one of the things that happened, there was a journalist from, I think, the Daily Mirror who interviewed them very early on in the fame, and he said the question got on to something like looks. How important are looks in the pop industry? And Vince said something like, well, looks can be quite beneficial in life. And that was sort of blown out of proportion by this journalist to be, along the lines of, well, if you're good looking, you're number one, don't bother if you're not. And, Vince would never have professed to be good looking. It was not something that even sort of featured in his life as such, you know. So I think he was devastated by that, you know, and he kind of became a bit of a recluse, and he wouldn't get involved in any of the interviews, and this is at the point when it was all just starting to happen for them, you know.
He did his commitments that were on at that time, but then that was it.
Many Depeche Mode fans think that Vince's departure changed the direction of the band for the better.
I think because Vince wrote so much, I think the entire album bar one song, when Vince was around, was written by him. So I think that was a lot of pressure to put on any member of the band, and specifically when they all just seemed to be his backing band, with Dave at the front singing. So, you know, it's quite easy to write off a band when their main songwriter leaves, which in this case turned out to be the biggest mistake anyone made.
And I think had Vince not left, it wouldn't have been the same band. You basically would have got Erasure with a few different people, really. Definitely for the sake of Depeche Mode and the band that they are now, I think had Vince not left, they wouldn't have anywhere near the fan base that they actually do now. Certainly the more industrial segments like Black Celebration and before that Some Great Reward, I don't think they'd ever have actually got to that stage had Vince not left. I mean, he didn't write particularly meaningful lyrics. I mean, if you look at Speak and Spell, and if you download all the lyrics off the internet or something like that, you'll find most of them don't actually make sense.
It's strange, when Vince was in the band, a lot of their songs seemed like straightforward rock and roll songs from sort of like the 60s, but done on synthesizers. I mean, there's songs like What's Your Name, which could have been a Beatles song. A lot of those songs are really straightforward, basic.
Martin does all the writing now. He's written all of the new album, which comes out September.
You lock him in a room, you see.
Yeah,
that's why he's in here today. You just lock him up and he writes
He's
all
locked
the
up,
songs.
he's writing
You let him
again.
out occasionally.
Put it this way, when Vince left the band, I knew that Martin would take it over and write the songs, because he was the only one who would be A, capable of doing it, and B, have the drive necessary to do it. I could just see him taking it on as a task, you know? And so it didn't surprise me at all, and it didn't surprise me again that Vince would become successful in his own right, because he had an ear for a pop song, and he knew what the ear for what was popular as well, which is just as important as an ear for a pop song. You know?
Yeah, well, they were different. I mean, Martin's music was based much more on the folk tradition, even. Even when you look at Personal Jesus, it's a folk song, really. And a lot of his songs are based on that folk kind of tradition, that softer kind of appeal. And Vince was much more, you know, up, synth.
See You, released in January 1982, but written by Martin years earlier, was beaten in the charts by Vince's new band Yazoo, with ex-schoolmate Alison Moyet.
The songs that we used to do that ended up, I think Depeche Mode ended up doing, there was one called See You, and he'd written that. And I think I did the harmony vocal and I invented some guitar line to it or something, but I Want My Money.
Martin does write on it by himself. I think